Hi economics students, in this video we're looking at the factors that affect aggregate demand. In the last video we looked at the components C, I, G, X minus M. Now we're looking at other factors that would impact those components, and it's a little bit like how we had our demand factors in microeconomics, because these things will shift the aggregate demand curve. Let's get into them. First one is disposable income. We've already done this in microeconomics. If households get a higher average disposable income, they're going to consume more goods and services. So it affects consumption spending. If there's an increase in disposable income, there's an increase in consumption, and vice versa. Of course, we're saying ceteris paribus, all other things being equal. And the other thing that may happen is there might be an increase in import spending. However, it would only be 20 cents in every dollar. So overall, that would still increase aggregate demand. Interest rates are a big factor determining demand at the moment. Interest rates are the reward for saving, the percentage rate for saving, and the cost of borrowing, the percentage rate for borrowing. And this impacts consumption and business spending because both households can borrow to spend and businesses. If there's an increase in interest rates, there is a higher reward for saving. So that is going to discourage consumption and encourage saving. So it would decrease consumption. Businesses would also be discouraged from borrowing to invest. Remember on the circular flow model that businesses borrow money from the banking sector in order to invest in new capital and equipment. And so if it costs them more to borrow, they would spend less on new tractors and technology. So we could say an increase in interest rates would decrease consumption. Let me get my pointer here. Would decrease consumption and decrease investment, and therefore decrease aggregate demand. The next factor is consumer confidence, a very simple one here. If people are more confident about the future state of the economy and their job, and they're more likely to make a major purchase, guess what? They will consume more, and vice versa. And again, all other things being equal, this would have the same impact on aggregate demand. We could also say there'd be an increase in import spending, but again, not by the same percentage. Business confidence is a new factor, and this measures how businesses feel about the economy and not how likely they are to make a major household purchase, but yes, you guessed it, how likely they are to make capital purchases in the future or in the next 12 months. So if they're feeling very confident about the future, a 7-Eleven might invest in a new coffee machine. That would be a component of, or that would be included in investment spending, and so an increase in business confidence would increase investment spending across the economy in all businesses, and all other things being equal would increase aggregate demand. Of course, some businesses do import capital, so there would also be an increase in imports. The rate of economic growth overseas is super important for our exporting sector. A common misconception that students make is that overseas economic growth would impact the demand for imports. It would not. The demand for imports comes from the rate of economic growth in Australia, because remember, if we're growing, we're going to spend on locally made goods and overseas made goods. So whenever you see the rate of economic growth overseas as an aggregate demand factor, it will only affect the X component of aggregate demand. Now, if China's growing at a rapid rate, which it has over the last 20 or 30 years, 10 or 15% per year, we are lucky to have iron ore and coal in the ground, which China needs for their rapid economic expansion. So when they grow, we see an increase in demand for our exports, and that increases X. All other things being equal, that would increase aggregate demand and increase economic activity. And of course, vice versa, if China slows down, which it may be at the moment, we're going to see a decrease in demand for our exports. The exchange rate is quite a tricky one, and we spent some time on class doing this. The exchange rate is basically the value of the Australian dollar when we swap it for another currency. So 1 AUD equals 0.67 US cents as of early 2023, which means 1 AUD will buy 67 US cents. Now, if the value of the AUD decreases, that means maybe 1 AUD would buy 50 US cents, and if it increases or appreciates, it might buy $1 US. So we have to think about an appreciation and a depreciation, and you should always think about what happens to the demand for exports and the demand for imports. and maybe a substitution to consumption. Let's have a look. So, if we have an appreciation of the Australian dollar, like I said before, that means the value of 1 AD increases to, say, let's call it 80 cents. That means for our exporting industries, their goods and services become more expensive. I'm not going to write that out, but exports become more expensive and imports become cheaper because our Australian dollar will buy more overseas. Therefore, export spending will decrease because overseas firms will purchase from other countries. They might buy coal from, India, and imports will increase because Australians will substitute away from consuming locally made goods. They won't buy shoes at Chadstone anymore. They'll buy them online. The opposite occurs if the value of the AUD depreciates. So if $1 Australian dollar is now worth 50 cents, that's great for exporting industries. That means our exports become cheaper. I'm just going to draw a downward line here, or a downward pointing arrow. And imports become more expensive because the value of our dollar is less. So we can't buy as much stuff overseas. So we will do the reverse substitution and we'll buy less imports and we'll buy more locally made goods. So overall, a depreciation is good for our exporting industries. It decreases imports and will increase aggregate demand. Now, just a little trick here before I go. Whenever you work out the impact on one of these, X or M, you just reverse the impact on the other. So if exports are increasing, imports will always decrease as a result of a change in the exchange rate. All right, bye for now.